This week on Inside Olympia, he's been on the job for just over a year. We meet Washington's Liquor and Cannabis Board Director, Will Lukela, who came from Colorado. What are his priorities for the agency? How is he addressing ongoing challenges in the cannabis industry? And how is the agency responding to changes in the liquor business? He's our guest for the full hour.
From the TBW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. Just over a year ago, there was a change at the helm of one of Washington's most scrutinized state agencies, the Liquor and Cannabis Board. Longtime director Rick Garza retired after 25 years. Hired to replace him was the Deputy Chief of Licensing for Colorado's Marijuana Enforcement Division. This is not an easy time to oversee liquor and cannabis industries. There are financial challenges and industry disruption. So what are the priorities of Washington's Liquor and Cannabis Board under new leadership? Where are the opportunities and the hurdles? And what can Washington learn from states like Colorado? Joining me now, and for the full hour this week, appearing for the first time on Inside Olympia, is Director Will Lukela of Washington's Liquor and Cannabis Board. Good to see you. Welcome to the program. Your first,
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
First interview on Inside Olympia since starting this job a little over a year ago. Let's just start with, why did you take this position? You're in Colorado. It, too, has one of the earliest legal cannabis markets in the country. We were pioneering states. What appealed to you about coming to Washington? I understand it was a promotion to lead an agency, but what in particular about Washington, this agency, and this opportunity?
You know, coming from Colorado and being one of the pioneering states, it's wrought with challenges. And I love to challenge myself. And so I've also been a Colorado native. Mm-hmm. And being able to have an opportunity after doing 31 years in Colorado government to take on a challenge of this nature was intriguing. Mm-hmm. And so I jumped at the opportunity.
What would you say, just do a little comparison and contrasting, and in particular in the cannabis space. In some ways, it seems like our two states have a lot in common, and no doubt have shared a lot of notes over the years, the decade plus since this experiment in regulated adult cannabis, came into being. But what's your observation about some similarities or differences that you've observed in your first year here?
Sure. So one of them really is Colorado's open market versus Washington State's. And I don't know, maybe closed market is the right thing. And so that's probably one of the most interesting. And when I was in Colorado, I was always fascinated by which market would be stronger through the ups and downs of the economy.
Well, help define this for us. What do you mean by open versus closed?
Sure. So in Colorado, there are no caps for cannabis licenses at the state level. The licenses are set from a cap standpoint at the local licensing level, but the state doesn't cap it. And here, there are caps on licenses. You can only have a certain number of producer, processor licenses, retailer licenses. And the markets that way are really different. And it's been interesting to see how that all unfolds.
Well, it seems like, and we'll just sort of dive into this because we're talking cannabis, and it's sort of the thing that unites, in many ways, these two states. The Colorado cannabis market, and it seems like markets across the country, have been struggling. They had this COVID era sort of boom, and then sort of a post-COVID slump. Colorado seems to be really struggling, though. There was a big piece in Politico recently, headlined, that this was, I think it's Colorado's weed market is coming down hard, and it's making other states nervous. Businesses are shuttering, laying off workers as sales have plunged $700 million. It starts to seem like doomsday. What's going on there, and how does it compare kind of to the economics of legal regulated cannabis here?
So I think during the pandemic, there was a lot of cannabis and even liquor sales. They were considered essential function.
Allowed to keep operating.
Correct.
Yeah.
And in both states. And that's probably the most fascinating part of the market here, is I think that with the number of business licenses in the state of Colorado, even though you're operating at a high rate during that time, you still have a certain number of people that are using the product. And you add more businesses to the market, and it starts to thin out the profit margins.
So have we in Washington weathered this better because we do cap
I think so.
the licenses? You
I think so.
Yeah. And so what does that look like in Washington? I've been asking you a lot about Colorado and asking you to compare, but what is the current sort of state of the economy of cannabis in Washington state? What are you hearing from business owners, from license holders? What are you observing about the prices, margins?
Sure. We're hearing that the price margins are decreasing, similar to how they are across the country. The agency actually paid for a study to have an economist put together a study on cannabis in Washington state to help us guide the number of licenses through 50/80 social equity program that we could potentially open up in the future. And it was telling. I mean, I think that, the goal is to avoid the gluttony of cannabis.
Right.
And hopefully we'll be able to land in I'll call it a sweet spot, while still allowing entrance to the market.
Right. So we have these caps, but you want there to be sort of an opportunity for people to still
Correct.
be coming in. And especially, and we're going to talk about the social equity licenses, especially individuals who have historically been marginalized and kept out of this space.
Correct.
So before we do that, I want to ask you for a little bit more context, though. So there's Colorado and Washington are good examples of early adopters, sort of the first states to go. We're now seeing, just in the last couple of years, a number of new states, new entrants into this, again, adult use regulated marketplace. How much are you hearing from them? Are you being asked, is the state of Washington being asked to consult with them at all? And I know New York has really struggled. I guess Minnesota is coming online. Sometimes it's in some ways it's better to not go first because you can learn from others. But what's your observation about sort of the particular challenges these new states face versus Connecticut's another good example of a new state. Like what's their experience? What are you hearing?
So I can tell you that New York has reached out to Washington State.
I think they need all the help they can get. From what I read.
I think they've got some challenges. I think they've got some challenges ahead of them. I think, we've been able to provide guidance, and I can speak specifically for them. They asked for guidance in the licensing, in setting up their licensing, some with the enforcement, but mostly geared towards the licensing. Being an early adopter, I mean, Colorado and Washington, I think you hit on it, is we used each other as a frame of reference. And so CANRA, which we kind of talked about initially.
And this is that is the Association of the State Regulators.
Correct.
You all now have an entity that's helping you communicate, compare notes, work together, think about sort of big picture policy.
Yes, and so we use that to spend a lot of time talking with regulators throughout the country about potential best practices. And so we're an open book here in Washington. We try to share all the good and the bad.
Is there an opportunity for a state like Washington to be learning from the newer entrants? Is there some
Absolutely.
advantage they have that we don't?
Starting later.
Yeah, right.
Right? So you're not, the phrase when I was in Colorado was you're building the airplane while you're flying it.
Yeah.
And so I think these new entrants to the market have the ability to actually build most of the airplane and fly it, and then hopefully tweak it according to what the needs are in their state and their rules and regulations, because that's what shapes the framework.
Let me pull in another piece that's very much in the headlines right now, and that is the federal farm bill a couple of years ago legalized hemp with the idea of allowing hemp-based products and non-intoxicating hemp on the market. It seems that the result is that people figured out how to make intoxicating products from hemp. that escape the regulated cannabis framework and structure. The governor of California just announced pretty tough regulations to try to address this. We're seeing all over the country examples where these products are competing with the cannabis products. I know a law passed in Washington, but how is that playing out in this state? I'm not hearing as much about it here as I am elsewhere, but what's the current state of play when it comes to these intoxicating hemp products?
Sure. So it essentially made it illegal here, which is probably why you're not hearing about it as much. There are certain states that have, I'll call it a conflict between the cannabis and the hemp. And they don't have these regulations in place. But the new law that came into effect actually made it a little bit easier for us in that regard.
So in that sense, because I know the hemp industry is saying they worry that they say regulation makes sense, but they don't like what California is considering. They don't want to put people out of business. They say that there's full spectrum products that are not intended to be intoxicating that are getting swept into some of this. And then furthermore, they're saying, if somebody is making the intoxicating products, well, let's regulate them, not put them out of business. So how is it working here? Like if somebody is the bottom line, can you have a full spectrum product that's not intoxicating here? Is that allowed?
Full spectrum by?
Well, meaning it has hemp, but it's not supposed to, and it may have some THC in it.
Okay,
but it's not
below 0.3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would that, in theory, be allowed here?
In theory.
And then anything above that, it's not that you brought them into the regulated marketplace. They're just not allowed.
Correct.
Interesting. Have you, in the year you've been here, have you heard from the hemp lobby? Are they pushing back on this? Do they want?
No.
And in terms of stuff being in the gas station shelves, the convenience store shelves, are your enforcement people running into any issues with illicit product or unregulated product? Are you hearing or seeing much there?
Not to my knowledge, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Do you have a sense, just because you've been in this space for so long, how this particular piece will shake out? I mean, I know that there's a push to get more clarity in the next version of the federal farm bill, but this seems to be a real unanswered question. It's happening state by state. The hemp people aren't happy and the cannabis people aren't happy. Right. Maybe Washington's avoiding the worst of the fuss right now. But it is, I know this is coming up in conversations with CANRA members.
Yes.
And you're no doubt hearing from your colleagues in other states that this is a problem. Do you have any roadmap for where this is going?
I'd say everything's split. I'd say everybody's split. I think no one really knows.
Kind of where this
is going to end up.
But it was unanticipated.
It was absolutely unanticipated. Yes.
Let's talk about the social equity licenses. Why don't we define that first? What is a social equity license?
Sure. So the social equity licenses are to help people that were disproportionately impacted from the war on drugs. And it's a certain number of licenses that came out in, 2870.
Yep.
And so when I got here, it was probably midstream, and we ended up having, I believe, a total of 40-something applicants. And
for how many licenses?
There were 40-something licenses,
okay.
Yeah.
So, and the reason I asked is I was just kind of curious what the demand was like.
What the demand was like.
Right.
So through the process, I want to say, and don't quote me, probably 300 and something applications boiled down to 40-ish licenses.
And so how much, so a bill was approved before you arrived in 2023 to essentially open up another round of social equity cannabis licenses. What is your sense of how effective this is? Like, what can you put the 40 in context for us? Is that a significant moving of the ball down the field and improving in access for people who have? And by the way, to get one of these licenses, there's kind of thresholds, but one of them could be that you had previously been charged and convicted of a marijuana-related offense.
Correct.
When it was not legal. And that could actually give you a preference point. So really trying to reach people who have historically been harmed by laws making marijuana illegal.
Yep, that's correct.
So what's your sense of, like, if we're trying in this state, if we're acknowledging that the way we set the system up, it excluded a lot of those individuals, now we're trying to sort of make up for that.
Correct.
And it's an iterative process. Do you have any, can you gauge?
Sure, and we're not alone in this.
Right.
Other states, unless you're one of the states, I guess that's probably
That's an advantage of being
it's
new,
the
right?
advantage of being
Yeah.
new,
Yeah.
is you can look at that and build that into your framework
Right.
initially. Are we moving the ball forward? I'd say we're moving the ball forward. Is it moving as fast and as large as potentially some would want? I think it depends. I think it depends on who you ask. Me personally, I think it's a great step in the right direction. I think that as we come out now with the licenses in 5080, and we're still going through rulemaking right now.
And that was the bill that passed in
And that's
2023.
yes,
Yeah,
that's the
right.
bill that just passed in 2023. We'll know more,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's a great step forward. I'm excited to see more licenses. I think one of the challenges that's always come up, or one that I hear, is the locations, is finding a location. And so while we have...
Is that because of local zoning?
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It's about local zoning and proximity to whether it's schools, other licenses, whatever the case.
Well, that's
may be.
certainly a curiosity I have, is it's one thing for the state to make the licenses available. That's an important first step, right? Because that's the barrier to entry, or has been. But once you get the license, what is your sense of, can the market bear additional license holders? Can these individuals make money doing this? Can, as you said, can they get the location that works for them?
Right. You know,
What other barriers or hurdles?
can they make the money? Some of it depends on the business plan. Some of it depends on the location. I'd like to think that if you're in the right location, you've got the right business plan, you can make money. I think that, you know, if you're in one of the smaller counties, and you'll have to correct me if I start pronouncing cities and
yes,
counties here,
you are
because
forgiven.
it's
Colorado
a challenge
native,
for me.
recent transplant to Washington, you get a pass.
We want them to succeed. That's what I'm going to say, is we want the social equity applicants to succeed, and we're giving them everything we can, at least at the agency level, to help them.
How much conversation is there about when this market was first created? The tax rate was set pretty high. You know, this was sort of viewed as, you know, a sin tax. I don't think anybody used that term, but I know there's been pushback about that. Is the board thinking about, is the tax level right? Are the licensure fees correct? Are the gates to entry and to operation aligned with what the market will bear? Is that a conversation you guys are having, or is it pretty much status quo?
No, we're having that conversation all the time, and the agency just within the last year put together a research team. It's a 3-person research team, which is going to help us get the data that we need to be able to make more informed decisions, which will be very helpful.
Do you anticipate a proposal in the future to the legislature from the agency, from the board, saying you should revisit the tax structure here?
You know, I don't know that that's our place. The Department of Revenue, we know that the industry is talking with the Department of Revenue and the legislature. I don't know that the taxing structure is our place at the Liquor and Cannabis Board, but we do have the conversations. Even the most recent one was surrounding high-potency THC and whether or not, you know, there needs to be increased taxes with
on those particular products.
Those particular products. And once again, you know, these are all concepts.
Right.
So.
Since you brought high-potency THC products up, what is as I understand it, the way that the legislature decided to handle this is to study, essentially, the impacts,
That's
not to regulate these products at the point, even though there are concerns about whether they might be triggering psychosis in young people, and the THC levels are not what were imagined 10 or 15 years ago.
Right.
what is your level, let's start with, what is your level of concern about these products from where you sit in this regulatory role?
Oh, it's concerning. It's concerning. So we spend a lot of time with the health prevention, behavioral health community, talking about impacts. And as we work through this, I'm hopeful that we can come to a successful resolution between the industry and the agency, which will help Washingtonians.
What is the timeline? Are we in a situation now where there's sort of going to be this ongoing study and then a report back and then
Yes.
sort of the next opportunity for policymaking
Correct.
potentially? And do you recall what the timeline is for that? Or
I don't recall offhand.
do you feel like, are you at this point willing to state whether you support some further regulation or some an initial regulation on these products to essentially, whether that's a limit on THC levels or some other way of managing this emerging
Right.
type of product?
We're open to everything. I think, myself at the agency level and then the board. I mean, it'll be the board at the end of the day that makes that determination. I think that as an agency, as a board, we're all concerned by the high-potency THC products.
Another question that's very much in the news is this potential for the federal government to reclassify cannabis and not make it a Schedule I drug anymore. I know this has been talked about over the years. It hasn't happened, but there does seem to be sort of renewed energy around it. What, based on the signals you are seeing or receiving and what you're hearing, what are you thinking about this, and how significant would it be or would it not be much of a game changer for what we're trying to do in a state like Washington?
I don't know that it's going to be much of a game changer for Washington. I think it'll help in the medical arena, but from the
It wouldn't make
recreational
recreational
retail,
cannabis legal
No.
at a federal level.
Correct.
It would just be a
That's
reclassification.
correct.
So in that sense, it's how would you sort of contextualize or frame the significance or insignificance of something, of reclassification, especially for the license holders who are
Right.
operating in this very weird situation where the state has said it's legal, but the federal government has said it's
Right.
not.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because I know in CANRA, in the last meeting, we talked about pharmacies. And does that open up pharmacies and the ability for pharmacies to, or for patients to obtain it through pharmacies?
Which could be another potential then avenue of competition for the
Correct.
regulated market.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Potentially.
So if the next step is getting to a place where it's the federal government somehow recognizes, rather than just having a hands-off approach to the states, but essentially says yes to banking, maybe, yes perhaps to legalizing, yes to interstate sales. I mean, do you see, and I know it's very hard to predict what the federal government's going to do,
Right.
but if we are in the second decade of this state-level experiment or state-level effort, do you have any sense of what the next decade might bring at the federal level, or what is the conversation?
So internally, we're working through what it would look like if it is rescheduled, and what the impacts are. And then let's say it's, completely descheduled. And we're poising ourselves here in Washington State to be able to address that in the future.
We have not, or correct me if I'm wrong, the state of Washington has not yet, or have we passed a law that contemplates or anticipates interstate sales being allowed? I know California has.
California has.
And I think it was introduced here,
Right.
but I don't think it passed.
I don't think so.
Is there some thought or talk about getting ready for when that, because obviously the concern that I would think the license holders have is if that were to happen, they want to be able to compete, and especially if a state like California is already allowing this, or
Correct.
has essentially a trigger law in place. So are you hearing, is there pressure to do this here or talk about it?
Yes, and we've been in contact with California and Oregon.
Yeah.
To
And I
talk
think they
through
did
that
it too
very
in
thing.
Oregon.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So we've been in contact with them to see what it looks like if the federal government does that.
What's the status of the illicit marketplace right now for cannabis?
Difficult to say. I think that one of the things that'll probably come up during our discussion today will be data and looking at our traceability data and trying to determine, inversions and diversions of product that go to the illicit market.
Why there is the illicit product that can end up on the illicit market, and then there's just people who can grow it outside of the regulated market. How confident are you that the tracking and tracing of the legally grown product, so that you don't have leakage, is robust enough to know, or do you think that system needs to be improved upon?
Well, I think the system needs to be improved upon. That's one of my priorities here is
better tracking
better tracking of a different system. So the system that we use, CCRS, was built, as I understand it, as a contingency system, a stopgap in between two other traceability systems for contractual or other reasons, and became a default primary system.
Right.
And we're actually in the process right now of undertaking that exercise.
So you're in full bore IT mode here, trying to come up with something that.
We're in the very beginning stages of it.
Yeah.
In the director's office, we actually hired a project manager and created a project management office within the director's office to handle all of our projects.
And this would also help you just understand the sort of the glut concerns,
Absolutely.
Right? Just what is the system's health?
Absolutely.
And what is the timeline, do you think, realistically, to stand up a new traceability system?
Realistically, boy, you're putting me on the spot.
And just add 5 years to anything you say.
And just add 5 years to anything I
It's
say.
IT, right?
I hope not.
Yeah.
I hope not. I mean, some of the initial projections were 2031.
Wow.
I'm hoping a lot sooner than that.
Right.
And some of it deals with the systems themselves and whether or not we can link the system with our current systems modernization project.
Okay, which I want to talk to you about
Sure.
as well when we come back from the break. So when we return, we continue our interview with Will Lukela, Director of Washington's Liquor and Cannabis Board. Back right after this.
I grabbed his foot to shake it to wake him up, and it was cold. The paramedics came in, and I'll never forget his look. It was like he felt so bad for me. This could happen to anybody. It has nothing to do with your parenting. It's just really getting that message to your kids so that when they go out into this world, they have a chance of coming back home.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Will Lukela, the Director of Washington's Liquor and Cannabis Board. So just building off of what you were saying about project management, new traceability system, which may take several years to get built and put online. More broadly, as you've come into this office into this agency with fresh eyes and are thinking about its operations, what are your observations, areas of concern, target areas for change?
Sure. So first and foremost was forming that project management office. We recently hired a project manager, and we'll eventually staff that office so that the office can actually run all of our projects that we have in our portfolio. The majority of them are IT. That was a gap in our operations that we've been able to address. And so this project manager is going to hit the ground running, and we've actually started surveying the industry with regard to traceability, as well as conducting an internal survey so that we can get all the information we need to be able to start the process.
So just to put this in context, and I was here when this system was first being built from scratch. We're now a decade plus in. How are you thinking about it? Is this essentially like we got to build the systems for decade 2 or decade
Yes.
2 and 3?
Yes.
And really modernize here?
Yes.
Because if you're running stuff on the same systems you built back when, it's out of date.
Mm-hmm. Modernization is huge for the agency. It's one of the biggest projects. I mean, I think you said we're going to touch on the systems modernization project.
Yeah.
It's It's modernizing old
Well, let's
databases.
just go right into that. I
Sure.
mean, what is that systems modernization project?
Sure.
What is it? What does it encapsulate?
Okay, so the systems modernization project is yet another thing I inherited. And it is a database which is going to house our licensing, our enforcement, our adjudications, all in one. And it's a multi-year, multifaceted project. In phase 2 right now, currently, phase 2 is set to end the end of March. And then hopefully we'll get the funding to be able to move on to phase 3.
What is your assessment, since you inherited this, of how that is going? Was it on the right track?
Sure, I think so. Initially, what I hear is the project has started and failed. This is the furthest, as I understand it, that this project has ever gone. We've done a great job at the agency level. Deputy Director has done a great job managing the project, and so looking forward to finalizing phase 2 and moving into phase 3.
And again, what's the timeline? Like, when might that be? Well, how many phases are there, and when might this be
So
kind of up and running?
right now, it looks like there's going to be 4 phases. The licensing phase, which is phase 2, will allow applicants and licensees to submit applications, permits, special event licenses, special occasion licenses, all online. And so we're really looking forward to that. And so the timeline, phase 2, phase 3, 27, hopefully fully operational. Don't hold me to this, 28 maybe.
Is this the kind of thing that you can borrow or crib from other states, or is there something that you were doing in Colorado in your previous role that you can bring to bear here in terms of this kind of modernization work?
Yes. So ironically, Colorado's getting ready to go through yet another modernization as well, because the system that Colorado uses is one that we've used since the very beginning.
Wow.
And I actually, when I worked at the Division of Gaming, we're using the same vendor for the same licensing system. So I think any time that you need to be able to upgrade and diversify and provide more IT support, it's going to be great. So,
what is your observation about within the cannabis world? There are different factions, there's different lobby groups. Some people talk about big cannabis versus the sort of more mom and pop cannabis. But how are you and how is this agency navigating the different kind of, again, with under the umbrella of cannabis, the different interests, the different business interests, and the different influence that those groups have?
I'd like to think we're navigating it pretty well. We spend a lot of time with the different industries, the different industry groups, understanding the pain points. I think when you talked about the big business versus the mom and pops, it's hard to, because they have different needs, right? Big business, one of the other, to fall back on the beginning of our conversation, one of the other pieces to the quote unquote big business in Washington State is the number of licenses you can hold. And so at 5, whereas in Colorado it's unlimited. And so big business here is a lot different.
Interesting.
And so when I think about that, I also think about concepts that are a little foreign to Washington State, but what Colorado already has, which is out-of-state ownership. Those conversations have happened since I've been here. I think it was a couple of the industry groups have talked about it. I don't know if I can't remember if there was a bill last year to at least introduce it. But we try to strive to be able to get the industry to move forward and to bring both the mom and pops and the big business.
So when you
together as
come
close
in
as
with
we can.
fresh eyes and look at what Washington has set up and then compare it to Colorado, do you see some opportunities, and do you think it would be advantageous and wise to maybe loosen the grip a little bit and to perhaps allow more licenses or to allow out-of-state investors to build a little bit more flexibility into a system that admittedly, I think when we started in this state, we were trying to be pretty locked down by design?
Right. Potentially. I'll say potentially. I mean, like I've said before. I mean, the board, they have their own opinions regarding these things.
And we should
as
just
well.
explain, you're the agency's director, but there is a board
Correct.
that
I
actually
report
sets
to.
the policy.
That's correct.
Right. So,
That's
so
correct.
you don't just get to say, yes, I think we should go do this. You can make a recommendation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But it's
Absolutely.
really, you're
it's
being
the board.
somewhat, you need to, yeah. So as you
Yep.
said, you work for them. So
Yes. Yep.
yeah,
Yep. I work for
understand.
them, and so what I'll say is they're open to having the discussions because we have these types of discussions and what Washington State cannabis looks like 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road. And one of the things that we have talked about recently is looking at the regulations and determining, is there the opportunity now, 10 plus years later, to update them based upon business practices and some things, like you said, things were really locked down in the beginning, and maybe that's the start.
So, and what I hear you saying in some ways is there's an IT modernization effort going on in this agency, but there's also potentially an opportunity to modernize the rules
Correct.
of the road as we get going here in decade 2.
That's correct.
California's governor just signed into law a bill he actually vetoed last year, but signed this year with some slight changes to allow for cannabis, Amsterdam-style cannabis cafes, where in essence, if you run a cannabis shop and you want to serve some food, some non-alcoholic drinks, have live music or that kind of venue, you can do that, and people can also smoke or otherwise take in cannabis. One of the concerns was about secondhand smoke effects on workers. California, like Washington, has strict laws about that. Right. But has there been any conversation about that idea? Or do you see, if California's going to do it, is that the type of idea that will sort of potentially come up the West Coast?
It potentially could. We've had conversations. There was an industry group that brought that up during the session last year. Nothing materialized. We're open to having the conversation. I think in addition to the secondhand smoke, there's also the concern about impaired driving, which is part of that conversation as well.
Let's just go back briefly to the economics of this right now. You said we in Washington have weathered the post-COVID economic climate differently, better than Colorado, in part maybe because we have a smaller system or a more capped system. But what are the sales trends? What are the price trends? Are we pulling in less tax money than we historically have? Do you feel like it? I mean, if you just look at the broad numbers, are things sort of down, up, steady?
I think things are down, but across the country they're down. I'd say they're down, but to a lesser degree than the other states.
Which is also, I would imagine, on the other side of the ledger here, and there probably are people saying, don't change too much.
Right.
Don't open things up too much, right? Because that could be...
Right, because then it could cause a slippery slope of sorts.
Right.
And so we're cognizant of it. And once again, that's why we're really excited to have this report as well as a research team to be able to help us work through the data.
Okay. We may come back to cannabis, but I have some questions about liquor. This used to be the Liquor Control Board, changed to the Liquor and Cannabis Board when cannabis was legalized, and conveniently, the agency didn't have to change its letters, just its name. So it's still the LCB. But historically, it was regulating the liquor industry and still does. There's this huge trend that I've been reporting on in the liquor industry to create alcoholic drinks out of traditionally non-alcoholic drinks, so sodas, juices, products that people are very familiar with seeing on store shelves that now come in a spiked or alcoholic version. And then there have been concerns about these products showing up adjacent to each other on store shelves. Some states, Illinois, Virginia, have taken steps to regulate or legislate around this. It starts with, I guess, getting licensed to sell this stuff in the first place, and then there's a kind of cascading set of decisions about how it's sold. But what's happening in Washington with crossover drinks, which seem to be a big industry trend?
Sure. So there are crossover drinks here. It's a concern, and it's a concern from a product placement standpoint. Are they
and
placing,
kids, right?
And kids,
Yeah.
Are they placing it in the toy aisle? Is it next to the soda
pop,
the soda?
Right.
So it is a concern. It is a concern. I think one of the things that happened, and I'll share just a quick story,
sure.
is wasn't in Washington, but it opened my eyes even more. Was in Florida, and was in a convenience store, and a young man came into the convenience store, perceivably to look for a Mountain Dew. Comes in, goes right into the first cooler that's just across from the entrance, picks up what he thinks is a Mountain Dew, runs over to the cash register, puts it down, and the clerk asks him for his ID. And he says, "I'm buying a Mountain Dew." And she said, "No, it's got alcohol." And he looks at the can, he reads, and he throws the can. He didn't understand that it had alcohol in it. And she said, "The one you want is actually around the corner." And so from a placement standpoint, I thought that was interesting, where you have the non-alcoholic Mountain Dew is around the corner, not in the mainstream. And so that was interesting for me to see.
You also raised the issue that critics have said some of the labeling just looks too similar to the non-alcoholic or the traditional product. And also, if potentially if the sale goes through and the kid gets it, some of these they don't taste very alcoholic, and so you could drink one and not even necessarily know. A little bit of taste testing I've done, it's not like drinking a mixed drink where it's very clear that there's alcohol in it. So what does this mean then in terms of what your agency and enforcement people, how are they encountering this? Have they run into situations where there were problems with placement in stores, anything like that? Any enforcement?
So we're evaluating it right now. Has there been enforcement? Not to my knowledge of that specific issue. I think any enforcement either would be at the law enforcement level, potentially from theft.
Yeah.
If you're placing it close to the registers and someone does the grab and go.
Right.
So I can tell you that the agency, the board, are looking at product placement. One of the other things that happened was I was in a store, I can't remember which one, but they had a barrel of mini bottles close to the checkout. And that's a huge concern, not just from a child standpoint, but from a recovery standpoint, those that are in alcoholic recovery.
If it's because
if it's right there, because it's the first thing you see,
out,
right?
Yeah, right?
So as you're walking out, I come in to get my milk, and I'm standing in line, and I look down. And so, like I said earlier, we're spending a lot of time with the prevention community and thinking about impacts to Washingtonians, and we're going to continue moving through and seeing what we might be able to do in rule versus legislation.
Yeah, and so has it gotten to that point of, given that other states have been enacting, I think in Illinois there was guidance initially from the agency, and then they passed a law this year. Virginia passed a law. Do you see momentum in that direction?
I see momentum in that direction. Yeah, we're definitely looking at it.
And what else are you observing about the liquor side of the house here in terms of your agency's purview and regulation of whether that's sales trends, youth getting access, which is obviously an ongoing concern. You have an enforcement division.
We do.
What are some top line takeaways or trends that you guys are observing or that you're hearing from your team on the alcohol side?
On the alcohol side,
anything in particular jump to mind? Or
we're continuing to do the compliance checks on the liquor side. They're not as high. They're not as high as we would like them. The compliance rate is not as high as we would like them. We need to spend some more time, in my estimation, in education.
Yeah, educating
the stores,
the clerks.
And even the public, and making it known that we are doing compliance checks and rehashing what the law really is. You would think it would be common sense to know, but re-educating the clerks and the compliance checks will hopefully bring up the compliance rates.
I'm not going to ask you to criticize your former state or your former agency or this agency, but can you compare and contrast us again, sort of more globally? We were talking a lot about cannabis, but just what's your sense of what is Washington doing right when it comes to liquor and cannabis control and management, and we've talked about some of the specifics, but where could we be doing better? Like if we were to be grading us, and you now have this perspective of coming from one state to another state, what's your kind of bigger picture takeaway a year plus in?
I'd give us a B. I'd give us a B and say that there's always room for improvement. I think we just talked about the compliance rates for liquor, and we just, to help with this process, we now will have 10 compliance consultants on the liquor side. We already had the compliance consultants on the cannabis side, which is different than what we did in Colorado. We did a version of it where the investigators themselves, we had criminal and compliance investigators in Colorado. And the way we're going to use our compliance consultants here from a true education standpoint is new.
So less, and this is a philosophy you've brought from Colorado, right? Is focused less on punitive and more on
That's correct. It's education that breeds compliance. And so I wish I would have known that, the younger me. But what I found through my time in Colorado is if you can educate the licensees and the public, then the compliance rates improve.
So you're really trying to bring that experience and lesson to this state, both again on the liquor and the cannabis side of the house.
Correct. I mean, and understanding there is still there still is a time and place for the punitive. If you can't get through the education and the compliance, then you have to utilize the punitive.
On the liquor side, we have this system that dates to the Prohibition era, or coming out of Prohibition, of a 3-tier system of manufacturers, distributors, and retailers. I know I read a blog from an attorney in Illinois who thinks that this is completely outdated and needs to be, blown up and ended. I think he's a little bit of an outlier, but I just want to, since I have you here, ask the question, is anybody talking about moving away from the 3-tier system, or is that pretty much here to stay for?
I think it's here to stay for now. That's what I'll say. I say for now because cannabis, liquor are industries that continue to evolve. And so I can say for now safely, but we'll see what the future has entailed.
I want to ask you about, and maybe we glossed over this, but you have the modernization effort. Help me understand more about the research team. You've actually brought in PhDs.
We do. We have 3 PhDs in our research program, which is phenomenal. And so they've been able to publish a handful of briefs and in different areas, whether they're they just did one a couple months ago on product placement.
Right. Yes, I read it.
Okay. And so as they do those, it's a new niche for the agency. And right now they're looking at all different kinds of briefs, whether it's in cannabis, whether it's in vapor, whether it's in liquor. And excited to have them. They each bring a different skill set, and they're able to analyze these data, which are important to our decision making.
And where do you see how this is sort of this value add, or maybe this sort of new tool or secret weapon that you guys have? But how how do you see them helping you make better decisions? What are the blind spots that this agency struggles with?
Sure, I think it's in the data, and I think it's in being able to drill down on the data from a pure data perspective. And I say pure data perspective because it's taking the data and not trying to formulate a conclusion, but being completely neutral and letting the data stand on its own. So whether it's
well, and to some extent, I think when this whole system was standing up and we had Rand involved and was doing a bunch of research. So in some ways, this is bringing this in-house, right? Saying we need to have an in-house research team. We can't just rely on university researchers. There may be stuff we want to jump on right now, and you can direct them and say, go do this.
Yes,
figure this out.
And then we can use that data, and it'll help us make decisions.
There was a bill that got a lot of attention this year that colloquially known as the Strippers' Bill of Rights. Gave certain rights to dancers, but the piece that I guess your agency has is that there will now be an allowance for liquor licenses for these establishments, where historically it was you can't have liquor. Is that right?
Yes, essentially. And so it allows for, like you said, the liquor to be on those premises. The agency does not have a adult entertainment license, doesn't have an adult entertainment permit. I can tell you where we've seen them thus far is existing liquor licensees that have adopted that behavior.
So are you finding that the adult entertainment venues are or are not coming in and now applying for or requesting liquor licenses?
I think we've only had that are applying for one that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Any insights about why that is? Do you expect that demand to increase? Is there any sort of sense of?
I don't know that I don't have a sense.
Okay.
I think that that's the only portion really that we have, that the agency has with regard to that bill. Labor and Industries has been tasked with the regulation of the provisions of that bill.
Going back to cannabis for a moment, lab testing is now in the hands of the Department of Agriculture.
That's
is that
correct. Right? It was going to the Department of Ecology and then ended up at the Department of Agriculture.
And this is also an issue that, as I understand it, kind of cuts across states.
Correct.
Constant conversation. We talked about traceability. What are the particular challenges around lab testing?
If we had another hour.
Yeah, which we don't. Give me the top line.
The top one is capacity. The top
Just being able to
just
get
being
the-
able to get the
product
test,
in,
to get the
yeah.
product in, get it tested in a reasonable amount of time, and then get it back so that we can make some decisions and do what we need.
How confident are you that the labs that are doing the tests are doing good work? Do we have good quality control?
I think. I'd probably have to connect with our enforcement folks on that. But I'd like to think that they are.
But it's obviously slow. It puts grinds things kind of to a halt if you cannot get your product tested. And it also then, I would imagine, creates incentives for people to go outside the system or to.
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah. So is Department of Agriculture's one of their mandates then to sort of figure out how to build more capacity into the system?
I can tell you that we're talking with the Department of Agriculture all the time, trying to talk about even the capacity issue. And then as the different types of tests come, you've got heavy metals, you've got pesticides. And so, it's a capacity issue, and hopefully we'll be able to make some strides in that arena.
Just briefly, for a while, there were a lot of headlines about very brazen and violent robberies of cannabis stores. I haven't seen as many of those headlines recently. What's the status of safety, security, and crime in and around these establishments?
Well, I'd like to think it's lessening. I would like to think it's lessening. At the agency, we have the ability for licensees to come and get a security review, which will help them with their footprint in that manner. But I think the crime is lessening. I think that licensees are trying to mitigate it however they can.
Yeah, that was a pretty daunting and serious little stretch in there where it was in the videos. There were videos and people could see just how scary and violent these were.
Yes.
We have less than a minute left. Where do you want to leave us? I mean, again, you're a year plus into the job, a lot of moving pieces and parts, but let's say we talk again in a year's time. What do you hope to be able to report?
Continued improvement, getting through the legislative session and being able to.
Is there a specific ask of the legislature going into January?
Not right now. I think that we're going to see what types of bills get introduced.
And there are always a lot.
And there's always a lot, especially with cannabis.
Right. Okay. Will Lukela, the fairly new Director of the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you
Executive
for having
Director,
me.
I should say. Thanks for coming in to talk to us.
Thanks for
And
having
we will
me.
do it again. And thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.